and on. We know there's a huge variety of hardware and systems out there. Sometimes sound quality might vary, but understand that there's little we can do about that on this end. If you do have a problem, you might try rebooting your computer. We've also posted a technical check link in the chat box. You can go to that and make sure that your system's working correctly. One other tip is make sure that you are not signed into the webinar more than once. Sometimes that can create problems. So again, we'll start in just a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will be back shortly. Okay, so I've turned off the audio broadcast, and we'll turn it back on in a minute.
And the recording has started, so we're in good shape there, it looks like. Somebody turned that on.
And I understand.
Welcome to Jump Right In, Getting Your Feet Wet with a Special Events Survey. This is a joint project of AASLH's Visitor Voices Committee and Small Museums Committee. We really wanted to do this webinar for you and called it Getting Your Feet Wet as opposed to dipping your, encourage you to do that. And of course, because we are talking about visitor surveys and things like that, we have some questions for you all to find out about who's in our audience. So I'm going to put our first poll out there, which is a question about AASLH membership. So if everyone would go ahead and let us know if you are an institutional member, an individual member, not a member yet, or aren't voting today. We'll see who we've got in our audience. AASLH serves both members and non-members through this platform, and I just like to encourage everyone who's not yet a member to join AASLH, and you can find information about that on their website at aaslh.org. And it looks like we've got some votes in. We're kind of all across the board. Our second poll is to find out who you are watching with today. So are you sharing your computer with friends and neighbors, or all by yourself? Most of our folks are by themselves, and if you're working in a small museum, that's pretty normal, and if you're doing visitor studies in a bigger place, sometimes you're the only person to do that, so that's also quite normal. And our next poll is to ask you how you found out about this event. I'm going to expand this out here. We've got a couple more options. So this lets us know kind of where folks are finding about us. And if you've put that other vote, why don't you go ahead and tell us in the chat box how you found out about us. That would be great to know. And because I know you all like participating, I'm full of questions this morning, or actually this afternoon. I would also like to know some of you who are connected with small museums and may have heard about the Small Museums Online Community, which is a project of the Small Museums Committee. I'd like to know if you know about that and are a member of it, just to kind of find out if that's where you found out about this sort of thing. Excellent. We've got some good responses from folks. Sounds like we've got nice sharing going on among colleagues with emails from friends. The Small Museums Online Community, will have a link to that later on in this webinar, but it is a special community just for small museums. We post blogs, and I'm going to have one more question before we get started, but I'm going to also note there's a box here on the screen that says VV-SMC Special Events Survey. We have several documents in there that you can download. One of those, the one that says 2013 Special Event Survey Data, is an Excel spreadsheet that we have as part of this project. We also have a template, a question bank, and guidelines for conducting the survey. So those are all resources that we'll be referring to throughout the webinar. You'll be able to download these at the end if you prefer to do it at that point. And the last file there is actually a set of the slides for this webinar. So if you want to share those with folks or just want to have a copy to keep track of, you can pull that down right now. All right, and my last question before we really get started is, what size do you consider your organization to be? And this was something that Conny was particularly interested in because she works with all sizes of institutions, whereas I work mostly with small organizations. So it looks like We're ending up kind of in the small to medium size range. And that's a nice sort of front-end type of research we're doing just to get to know you. All right, well, thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and move our download to encourage you to do some form of visitor study in your own institution. And that might be by using a version of the special events survey template that we've created and we'll share with you. And if not that, maybe it will just help you think about and feel more comfortable with whatever your next step in doing visitor studies or evaluation might be. For some of you, it may be the special event survey. For others, it may be something, a different kind of step, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about how you make those decisions and you'll know what's the right next step for you. We'll also be spending some time, and Connie will really focus on this, in understanding how to determine what it is you need to know from a visitor study or evaluation. What is it that your organization can actually use right now so that the data you collect is valuable to you? So that is what we're looking for. And of course, we'd like to promote our two groups, Visitor Voices and Small Museum Affinity Groups from ASLH, and hope that if you're not connected with those groups, you'll join us there.
It's great to have everyone together, and I just wanted to say a few words about the Visitors Voices Committee. The purpose of this affinity group at ASLH is to bring together people who are interested in discussing and sharing and advancing the work of audience research and evaluation in history museums and related institutions. You do not have to be an expert. In fact, if you don't have any experience, that's okay. It's really a group for people who are interested in sharing and learning all about evaluation. Our group produces a newsletter, and we have a visitor research resource list. And we also sponsor sessions at the annual conference, ASLH conference. And participation in this committee, as in all other ASLH affinity groups, is free. And we're going to give you the link where you can sign up for this affinity group as well as for the Small Museums affinity group at the end of this session. I have to apologize to Sherry Cook because I just realized she has been a real leader of this group, and I want to applaud her and thank her for all the incredible work she has done for keeping us together and on track.
And this is just a thank you to the Small Museums Committee who had supported this project, but also beyond. And you can find out more about us at the Small Museum online community. So with the promotions out of the way, we again like to learn a little bit more about you and your experience in doing visitor studies and how you feel about this kind of work. So I've got two questions for you. I'm going to pull out those polls. What one word that we can throw out here best describes how you feel about evaluation? And I'm trying to expand that out. There we go. About visitor studies and evaluation. So I personally have felt any and all of these emotions sometimes simultaneously when I have worked in visitor studies and evaluation, both with small organizations and within the larger organization that I'm a part of. So, kind of across the map. And kind of related to that, we'd also like to know what your level of experience in doing visitor research. All right, it looks like we've got experience. I also see that some folks are feeling overwhelmed in an experience, so kind of not exactly sure about it and tentative, and other folks are feeling interested and enthusiastic, and we have to say that we sway between those emotions back and forth. After we finish the webinar, we'll ask you how you're feeling about it and see if we've changed your point of view at all. So thank you so much for participating and joining us with that. I want to give you a little background about my work with visitor studies. I am the past chair of the Small Museums Committee, and I do field services for local history folks here in Indiana. And I've taught several workshops in visitor studies, but I find that they are rarely used. People rarely get to the point where they actually do a visitor study after they've come to a training session. And in thinking about that and talking with the Small Museums Committee, several folks identified some barriers for small museums to doing this work. And these are the barriers that are true for a lot of things that we do in small museums, but also in large museums. No funding and no time. Those are sometimes we don't have the time to get that training or to really think about how to do visitor studies appropriately. I've also found that for folks who have taken the time to get the training, sometimes the experience is overly intimidating, that visitor studies really emphasizes scientific protocols and rigor and data analysis, and that can make the process a little intimidating. And so we want to sort of lessen that intimidation factor with the work that we're doing here. And also I find, and this was very true for me, that if you make an initial attempt at doing a visitor study, you can be incredibly discouraged because you didn't get exactly what you wanted. And so one of the things that Connie will really talk about is how to think about a project from the beginning so that the results will be as helpful to you as they possibly can be. And so the organizations, even nature centers. But for smaller places in particular, I think we have such close contact with our visitors that sometimes it feels like a little bit of a waste of time to go through this very orderly procedure to gather the information. But what you really find in doing true data collection is that you get something that is well respected and isn't sort of based on anecdotes or kind of a general overall feeling. Sometimes it makes a more persuasive argument. And the other reason I think small museums don't do this is that we haven't offered any shortcuts. Small museum folks are responsible for all the things that have to happen in a large museum, but they do it with less staff and fewer resources. And so I think we depend on shortcuts. And my sense was that I have been spending a lot of time giving folks eggs, giving you all the background and giving the folks that I work with in training all the things they might need to get it done. But maybe we'd be more successful if we could give you all some chickens. And so I talked with Connie and said, hey, could you help us out and provide us with a chicken? And for that, I'll ask Connie to talk about the chicken side of things. And I may have just advanced that one too far. Go ahead, Connie.
Okay. Well, my experience is I've been working in museums for about 30 years as an interpretive planner and a trainer and evaluator. And right now my focus is helping museums determine what they want the outcomes as a result of the visitor experiences, and then help museum staff find out how to evaluate these outcomes. My very first experience many, many years ago was doing a survey when I was doing special events for a small historic site. And every Monday morning after an event, my supervisor would call me and ask two questions. How many people came and how much money did we make? Now, I understood the need to raise money and to bring in visitors, but I was also interested in trying to make each event a meaningful learning experience for the people who came. So I started thinking about how can I prove that these events are also meaningful learning experiences, which led to, so what do I mean by a meaningful experience and how do I define that? So I did some experimentation and I did my very first survey at one of our special events. And for this very first survey, I was only able to interview about 10 people. But during that experience, and more importantly, many people had some great ideas for how we can make the experience better. And so that experience actually inspired me to learn as much as I could from other colleagues about how to do visitor research. Now fast forward 30 years, and I'm talking with Stacy Klingler, and she says to me, what would you think about drafting a template for a survey that small history museums could use? And my first thought was, no, I don't think that's possible because every site is so different, every program is so different. But then I remembered my experience with a special event survey, and I said, well, maybe we could put together a template for a special event survey. So that brought us to thinking about the pros of having our first template be a special event survey. A special event is usually when small historic sites can gather up the most number of volunteers, so you can get help in doing surveys. It's not a huge investment of time and money, and most historic sites end up doing special events. So we figured, well, maybe this would be a good way to get our feet wet. So when you're putting together a survey and you're trying to figure out what questions to ask, and the best way to do that is to think about what are the decisions you're trying to make about your special events. Because one thing that's absolutely critical is that you only collect information you can actually use. If you have a list of questions on your survey, if you see that there's some information you're collecting that would not lead you to make a decision, then my advice is do not ask it. Because it's easy to collect data, but it's hard to know what to do with it after you're done. So Stacy and I started brainstorming, well, what do you think most sites would like to know from visitors about their special events? And we talked about issues of satisfaction and how people were satisfied or not satisfied with the visitor services, with the activities, the hands-on activities for families, satisfaction with the way the staff greeted visitors. Also information about visitor demographics, where are they coming from, and people are coming to us on their day off with family and friends, and they really are looking for a pleasant experience. So we started putting together some ideas, and here is the beginning of a list of questions that you'll see if you downloaded the special event survey. You'll see some of these things on the survey. So Stacy, do you want to take over from here?
Sure. So like Connie said, we kind of whittled down that big list of questions about things you might possibly want to know to kind of these core ideas of what did they like, how did they find out about the event, why did they come, who came, and did they learn anything new? We can't answer all the questions, but we wanted to start with those. And so if you downloaded the materials, you might go ahead and take a look at the actual special event survey template. And if you haven't downloaded those, I've got all the information here, and we'll bring that up for download later. But we wanted to start out with rating levels of satisfaction with kind of the basics, rating the satisfaction with the learning experience and with the overall experience. So kind of a really easy way to start out, just asking people to provide some ratings. And then you want to dig deeper. You can't just ask them if they were satisfied, because if they say they weren't satisfied, you really want to know, what it was that was a problem. And so there's a follow-up question that says, if you rated any of those items at 3 or below, please tell us what we can do to make it a 5+, so that you have a chance to really ask folks what would make your event better. Then we ask a couple sort of questions from the marketing world about, would you recommend this event to family and friends? That's kind of one of those core questions that says, you can be satisfied with the event, but if you really liked it, you would recommend it to other people. And then we ask about how folks heard about the event, what marketing streams were working to get that information out. And then what motivated folks to come to special events. Sometimes we have special events that we host that we really hope, it's going to be a great learning experience. People are going to be truly fascinated. They drove by and they saw there were people here, and, they just wanted to stop in. It was kind of a spur of the moment. And so knowing about why people came to an event, we thought would be useful for helping people make decisions. Then, as Connie mentioned, we wanted to gather some demographic questions, questions about race, questions about how far away people are coming. And you can see we've got a pretty broad range there. Asking about the ages of the people who came to the event, and asking if the person who filled out the survey was male or female, those kind of basic demographic questions. And then there's a little nudge asking folks if they're members of the museum or historic site that's where this event is happening, and if they would consider becoming a member, and a place to collect email addresses. You've got a captive audience. You definitely want to try. For some folks, maybe they want to use all the questions, and that's useful, but as Connie said, we really want to think about what questions are going to give you information that's going to help you make decisions. If knowing about the parking is going to be helpful to you, then you should ask about the parking. If it's not going to be helpful, then there's no reason to ask about it. So there's no need to keep all of the questions that are on the template. We hope that you can take off the ones that don't matter to you, or that you'll adapt them for your situation. So for example, in that question we have about how far away do you live? Well, maybe it's useful for you to know if people are living within 5 miles or 10 miles or 20 miles, or if they're living in your town or in your county. So we do hope that folks will adapt those categories to make the most sense for where they are. So we did this project and created this through 2011 and 2012, and then we asked a couple folks to pilot test it. And so we worked with 2 groups, one in Utah and one in Indiana, to test out the survey. And here are some of that the person who's leading this effort really needs to test out the survey and practice with it, even if it's just with friends, neighbors, other volunteers, so that they feel comfortable. Both of the directors who had this experience really felt like they themselves weren't as comfortable as they wanted to be, and that maybe they communicated some of that to the volunteers they were working with. We also found that for both those groups that they had trouble recruiting volunteers to actually do the surveys. And the surveys at that point were designed to be interviews, to be having somebody walk through your special event and have one of your volunteers with a survey in hand and say, let me talk with you about these questions. But neither of them were able to recruit people who felt comfortable with that. And Connie, I think that was a little bit of a surprise to you, if I'm right.
To go out and talk to strangers.
So I might ask, actually, if anybody would like to post anything in the chat about their experiences in either collecting surveys or working with volunteers, about how they might have successfully encouraged people to be those volunteers, to be out there with the clipboards and talking with folks. Because one of the other things that these 2 directors discovered, because they used the survey, but they just put it on clipboards or asked people to fill them out after the fact, usually answer the questions as completely, and you can't follow up and really dig in about why they're answering the way they are. And so it really left our 2 pilot testers wanting more information. And in particular, folks wanted to learn more about if people were really learning, if they were really meeting their organizational mission in doing this kind of special event. And we did have one question about learning and satisfaction with learning, but for most folks, both who were the pilot testers, but also when we shared this at the AASLH conference in 2012 with an audience, there was really that sense that learning outcomes and meeting mission were important. And so Connie dug in deep and made some revisions related to outcomes.
So I want to talk a little bit about defining your outcomes. And this really is the hardest part about doing any kind of survey. And I'm listing here some activities that you can do to help you figure out what you want people to know, feel, and actually see people are doing during the event. In fact, if you can imagine a videotape of people at your event, write down what you think would be indicators that people are enjoying, learning, sharing, having a good time. The other thing is to visualize what people are talking about after they leave the event. Another exercise I've tried with museum staff is ask them to imagine that the event is done and you have the survey results in front of you. And you're looking at that report and you're thinking, wow, this is great. Now we know what to do and how to do it. What do you hope to see in that survey? Again, going back to this whole idea of, and I really recommend that you do it not just with your own staff and volunteers, but it's really beneficial if you do this brainstorming with members of your local community, either individual members or leaders and members of nearby local organizations such as Girl Scout troops, churches, the YMCA, performing arts organizations, other nonprofits, because in doing so, you will while you're also getting some wonderful ideas about the special event that you're planning, will really help to generate community interest in the program you're offering. Once you have this list of what you want people to know, feel, and do as a result of the event, and again, I should say, you want to do this list for what people are thinking about and doing during the event, and then also a list that identifies what people know, feel, and do after the event. You'll come up with a pretty long list. And this is the second hardest part about doing a survey, is you have to edit like crazy. And I always say, take your list, cut it in half, divide by 3, and then do it again. Whoops, I don't know what that was. But keep in mind, this is just one event, and people may only spend an hour or 2, so you don't want to have a whole long list of outcomes.
Connie, I wonder if we might experiment a little bit. Lucy Barton has posted in the chat something that she is interested in learning about her special event, how to make that event more engaging and more interactive. And so could we think about talking about that idea in terms of how you would go through this process of defining outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Getting people engaged and interactive is something I hear a lot about. And the trick to that is for you to think about, well, what do you mean by engaging? What does engaging look like? Again, if I were to come and videotape your program, what would be the indicators that people are engaged? I mean, would they be doing hands-on activities? Would they be sharing things with each other? Would the parents be helping their children work out some activity or demonstration? You really have to unpack these really big words that we throw around all the time, engaging, interaction, in order to determine what that might look like. And once you can visualize what that might look like, then that will lead you to ideas for how to make that happen. I don't know if that's helped. And Stacy, I just have to say that
so Lucy, I might ask if you have a moment and wanted to type in something about what you mean by engaging or interactive, maybe thinking about visually what that looks like. And maybe all of you can think about a special event that you have to imagine what are people talking about after they leave your event? What would you like to see happen so that you know that your event was a success? Something else Rebecca Rogers posted was that she's also interested in finding about if the event should be repeated and has it reached the end of its life cycle. And I think that is always an important question for special events. A lot of us keep doing the same special events over and over and over again. So Connie, do you have any advice about trying to get to that idea about the event maybe being on the decline, or if people are losing interest in an event?
Oh yeah, that's another good question. I think we tend to always, have the 500th annual quilt show and wonder, should we still be doing these quilt shows, or should we just put a kibosh to it? And I think some of that has to do, obviously, with what the mission of your museum is. It actually has a lot to do with what the purpose of this event is. What do you want it to do for you and your site, short-term, medium range, and long-term? I'm sure you know this. You would never put on the questionnaire, do you think we should stop doing this event? But if you see attendance waning, I think it's a really good time to ask yourself this question. And also ask yourself, who are we trying to target? Who are the people that we hope to come to this event? The other thing you consider doing is going out to your community. Again, the more you involve your community in producing and brainstorming about these events, they might also say, well, there are about 100 quilt shows around here, and there's just too many of those around, so let's think of something new and different. I don't know if that helps or not.
So it might not be that you can ask your visitors, has the event reached the end of its life cycle, but you can look at who's coming to your event, maybe look at the demographics of people coming. If an event is targeted to bring in new people and you just see museum members coming, then that really tells you you're not meeting that goal of bringing in new people. So that might be a way to know if it's at the end of its life cycle. Really have to think about let's say that was great. I can't wait for the next event. So that idea of just creating enthusiasm and excitement, I think, sounds pretty compelling.
Yeah.
So if you can't come up with these questions on your own, just if you're not sure where to start, we have solutions for you, don't we, Connie?
Yes, we do. So measuring your outcomes. One of the files that we asked you to download, I think Stacy is putting up the box, let's see, which file is it? The survey question bank. I'm trying to see which one it is on your list, Stacy.
It is VVSMC Special Event Survey Question Bank, the second one down there on the list. That is the two-page list of questions you might be able to choose from.
Okay. So knowing that writing your outcomes and figuring out how to measure them, how hard it is, we went ahead and developed what we call a survey question on that template that are not useful to you. And these questions might also spark you to come up with better questions that will be more useful to you. And if you have the document, you'll see that on the first page, the questions I've listed here are broad, open-ended questions. And these are questions that really are very visitor-centered because they allow the visitors to describe in their own ways what made the event special for them. So questions like, were you expecting to learn something today? And if so, what were you expecting to learn? And do we meet those expectations? Why or why not? Were there any particular highlights of your experience today? And if so, why were those highlights for you? Was there anything about this event you think will stick with you after you leave? Yes, no. If yes, why? If not, why not? One I particularly always like to ask is, has this program made you think any differently or more strongly about? And then fill in the questions. Now these do take longer because they really get people to think, and they have follow-up questions. So these are kind of questions that you don't want to ask more than one or two because you see they will take time. But they could lead to some really interesting pieces of information that you might not get with a very close-ended survey. I'm finally getting my chat box working now, and I see a question here is, should you do an evaluation for every event? Oh, absolutely not. That would be crazy. I don't know anybody that would have time, even a large museum, to deal with the data from every single event. I think you just need to focus on what are the events that you have some critical decisions to make for in the future. And you have to look at this process as a process that helps you make decisions about the future. And that might even include not having an event. No, I just picked key events. But getting back to the question bank, the second page is a list of closed-ended questions. And these are actually samples of possible outcome statements. Statements that say a little bit about what you might want your visitors to think about, feel, or do. And everyone, and you'll read one of these two statements out when you're doing the interviews, and then you'll see this. I developed an increased interest in, transportation in the 19th century as a result of this event. And as you can see, these are not yes or no, but gives you some degree of how much these outcomes were working or not working. This visit inspired me to want to know more about, fill in the blank. From the emotional side, I felt an emotional connection with the story of the people who lived here, with the story of the people, ... I saw something today from a very different perspective. So you can go through this list and pick some of these if you wish. And again, these might also help you begin to define the outcomes that you want for your event. And once again, like in the regular survey, after they rate, and again, I would only put one or two, maybe three at the most on a special event survey. If there's anyone that rates it a 3 or below, you really do want to follow up and ask what would make it a 5. and site. It's peaceful or quiet. They're with their family and their friends. So this halo effect pushes people to really give you 4s and 5s, whether it's a special event, a program, or an exhibit. And if you get a 3, that might not seem like a red flag, but in the perspective of all the data I've seen, a 3 could potentially be a red flag. And so you really want to dig deeper and find out if that is the case. So I think that's it. I'm looking at the chat box right now. Somewhat Wilson saying, I think it's important to evaluate every chance you can. And I'd say, yes, Wilson, I agree. I just worry if you have the resources to do it for every event. And if you do, that's wonderful. But and I also agree.
The collection of that data and get it analyzed so that you can use it, then that's great. It's an excellent habit, and just as Wilson said, and if you can make it simple, so that it's not a huge amount of data, then you can collect the answers to just a couple questions just about anywhere, and not make it too cumbersome. So what we wanted to do, and we did this last year in using some more pilot testers. Well, we changed the survey around a little bit and recruited some new folks, and I'll be introducing those folks in just a minute. We've got 2 people from Indiana who pilot tested the survey and are going to give us some feedback about how it worked. And we'll start with Matt Schuld from Elkhart County History Museum. He's their museum manager. Matt, welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Would you tell us just a little bit, just a few minutes about the event that you evaluated, that you used the survey with?
Yeah, sure. Well, the event, as you guys see on your screen there, we're having a 150th anniversary event for the Civil War, and our museum has a collection of allowed to really bring them out that often. So we created an event, and these maps show Civil War battlefields, and they're drawn by a well-known cartographer from the era. And we brought them out for a special one-day exhibit. We got approval from the family, and had to go through that whole process, and then promoted the event as a one-time special viewing with a special presentation at 1 o'clock. And there you see our curator of education talking about Indiana's role in the Civil War. And so we had people coming through the door basically all day, and anytime you say Civil War, attendance seems to jump by about 400%. So we're always happy to take advantage of that as far as our attendance numbers. So then the event culminated, of course, in this special presentation, and we surveyed throughout, and then we also surveyed after the presentation. So, yeah, that's basically the event in a nutshell.
And Matt, did you hand out paper surveys, or did you do interviews?
We did interviews throughout.
And how many folks did you work with, staff and volunteers, to do those interviews over the course of the day?
We used staff, and there was
over the course of the day?
10 surveys is what we were able to grab.
And the attendance at the event was about?
Well, the picture you see there probably had about 60. I'm sure we violated fire code, in fact, in that small room. But as far as throughout the day, I think we had about 120 people.
Okay. Well, that's just to give everyone an idea about that event. We're also going to be talking with Mary Chrastil, who's the president of the North Manchester Center for History in North Manchester, Indiana. And she was able to use the survey with 2 different events. Mary, would you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. I want to start out by telling people we're a really small town. We have about 5,500 people, and that includes some college students. So if we can do it, you can do it. And we're an all-volunteer organization also. So let me tell you about the 2 things we collected for. The first was, and this is the bottom picture there, we had you don't have a picture of this one. We have a monthly dinner meeting that's attended by anywhere from 85 to 150 people every month, and these are lecture meetings. And we chose one of them to do our survey. We set the survey out after the program. The program was a video on the Grand Kankakee Marsh, which is used to be called the Everglades of the North. It's an important to fill out surveys as they left. We passed out paper surveys to the audience, and we got about 86 surveys back. and I'm going to say that's probably 3/4 of the audience complied, which is very nice. And then the other event was we celebrate Historic Preservation Month every year with a program. The program started here at the Center for History, and then the group dispersed into 4 subgroups that toured restored homes in our community. So this is a little bit of a challenge for taking the survey, and what we did is we had collected the names of our visitors in our guest book, and after the survey, we mailed paper surveys to most of the attendees. And we got back, I'm going to say about 16 or 17, and this is out of maybe 30 people that came. So again, it was a really good response.
So, Matt, let me come back to you. How did the survey process go for your organization? How did the staff and the volunteers kind of feel about it? And you know, what was the process like?
Yeah, well, the process was very smooth. The downloads that you made available here to the group are the same ones you gave to us, of course, and the things like the guidelines for conducting the survey really were beneficial in walking everyone through it. Now, I would say if I had a chance to, and I assume I will have a chance to do it over again, when we do this again, we're going to spend more careful attention, basically, as Connie said, walking through the survey beforehand without having actually a visitor there, because I think there's certain times where people get they sort of lose track of where they're asking the questions with the visitor, and people get distracted in the museum, the person taking the survey. So there's a couple things we probably would have changed. Namely, one example would be that we distracted them, or they would have had other family there that was kind of waiting on them. So I think if we could do it again, we may do it right at the exit, or even in the parking lot if the weather was nice enough, or when people are heading to the parking lot, sort of grabbing them there. But beyond that, I think everything with the survey, as far as actual conducting it, went very smoothly, and everybody was comfortable with it. Now, I said we used staff, and I think if we used volunteers, it would take even more special attention and some kind of training seminar. And probably even how we would do that, for example, would be getting a specific group of volunteers that only did surveys, or that was one of their main job responsibilities, because like somebody mentioned earlier, I think when you just ask somebody to staff for this process. So, and then as far as collecting and putting the data together, that was really easy with the collection. The material you sent us allowed us to basically just input it right in there. I could step back to just the planning process as far as asking the questions. For example, somebody mentioned, I think it was Connie mentioned, that you should really only ask questions that you're prepared to act on, and that's why we removed quite a number of questions that we really knew we couldn't affect the outcome of it either way. For example, the parking. We removed the question about parking because we didn't think we were at any stage to alter the parking arrangements at the museum at this point, just with our funding and kind of what our situation is currently with our building and the park we're in. So we just took that right out and said, this isn't going to be, and I don't think I really did it consciously, but I just basically knew, I can't change this at this point. So we removed that from the survey. But overall, I think everything went smoothly.
Great. Mary, did you adapt any part of the surveys?
Oh, absolutely. The basic demographic information we kept pretty much as it was. We had 8 closed-ended questions. Did I learn something valuable about my community? I left the event more interested in the history and ecology of the area than when I came. I could make sense of what I saw. I'll probably attend future Historical Society programs. It was an enjoyable experience. The overall quality of the program, and those were on a scale from 1 to 5. And then we added some open-ended questions, which I think were probably the most helpful. Were there any particular highlights of your experience with this program? What were they? And were there any particular things you would change? What were they? And if anything was rated a 3 or below, how could we make it a 5? And we got some really good information event, and we will do that again for future events. We're going to use this again when we have our town festival next week. And we have the museums open for free and people walk in, and this is a great opportunity to say, what would it get you to come back? So we'll probably be focusing on those sorts of things. One thing about the process here, of course, it was the unusual thing of mailing the surveys to people, and that worked. I think the written surveys were less intimidating for people. They didn't have to answer a live person. And I think they were pretty candid in their responses because of that. And the last thing I'd like to mention is that, again, we're an all-volunteer organization, and we don't have time to do this. But I have a high school student that wanted to be a volunteer this summer, and this is perfect for a high school student project or any really kind of docent project where they can, there's no deadline on, compiling the data, first of all. And there's no, it's interruptible if something else comes up. So
Always nice to recruit some young people to get involved.
yeah.
Mary, we did have a question from the audience, and Dennis from Canada asks, how did you get visitors to give you their mailing addresses? Did you have an incentive?
We knew most of them. So that was a fairly small group. There were only about 30 or 40 people that came to that program. Some of them did sign our guest book and put their addresses in there. And if we had that information, many of them were already in our database for one reason or another.
And I'll kind of add to that, Dennis. If you do use any sort of visitor register, it's always good to ask people for their addresses if they're willing to give it. But note that that's an optional sort of thing. I know when we collect demographic data, we try to ask for town or zip code. We'll go ahead and I think this, Rebecca, we will talk about online surveys a little bit later, and I'm going to let Connie sort of address that. We haven't created a version of that for this particular survey, but I think that's an interesting idea, and so we'll comment on that a little bit later in the session. I did want to ask both of you which questions you felt where you got the most surprising result or the most useful result. Were there particular questions that either sparked your interest, you said I didn't expect that, or where you were able to say, this tells us something that we're able to act on? So Matt, let me start with you. Was there anything that you learned from the survey that was sort of an actionable piece or that really surprised you?
Oh, well, I think for us, probably the most actionable, the most immediately actionable piece was, how did you hear about the event? That's just, we're not, like a lot of the people that responded to the survey you put out earlier, we're inexperienced at giving these surveys. Some of the things surprised us right off. I mean, we spend a lot of time producing material for a publication we do that goes out to, like local coffee shops and that sort of thing. And virtually nobody had heard about the event from that, and that kind of told us, we better keep an eye on this because we're dedicating a lot of time to this, and we're not necessarily getting the payoff from it, which part of the payoff for that publication, or part of the reason we do it, is because it advertises our events. But my sense is that we really need to change something about it, or just stop putting so much energy in it altogether, because we were finding people were coming from local hotels, or they were hearing about the event more frequently in things like either the regular newspaper or even those little breakfast restaurant newspapers. You guys might have them called Coffee News. We know we'd get people coming and saying they saw it in that. So that was the most immediate and from more than 120 miles away, but not a lot of people from neighboring counties were coming to the events, at least according to the survey we did.
And Mary, how about you? Was there a particular question that was most useful to you at this point, or that had a particularly surprising result?
I think so. I think we're always interested in the same thing as Matt. How did you hear about the event? We live in a town that has very little local media. We have a county news, a Wabash County, Wabash City newspaper that's a daily, and then we have 2 weekly newspapers, but people don't read the newspaper that much anymore. So we're always challenged in finding out how to get the word out. And so that was very helpful. And I think not only that, but it makes us think, restore, and said, what media do you listen to? How do you find out about things going on in your community? We might be able to learn there how to spread the word a little bit. People are very happy with the programs they come to, but they don't necessarily come to them. Or we often hear people say, oh, when was that program? Oh, it was last week. Oh, I was kind of thinking of coming, and then they missed it. So media is a problem. Another thing that was actually sort of interesting was we asked, how could we improve this? And one of the one of the questions was, the meal price is a little steep. We have people can buy dinner before the monthly lecture programs that we surveyed, and that's not exactly in our control because we contract with the vendor at the spot where the dinner is held. But we can at least explain to people that, or how it works, or whatever. So maybe at least there can be some understanding, if not acceptance, about that question. And that I think those are the 2 main things: how we could improve, and where people heard about us. That's always the challenge.
Well, and then I'd like to ask both of you again, if you think, having done the survey, are there questions you wish you would have asked, or other questions you might think about asking in the future that would help you make decisions? Matt, is there anything that you're thinking about, questions that you wish you would have asked?
Didn't use words maybe like tell us about your experience, but more so focused on what educational benefits you got out of this. Now I don't have the questions bank in front of me at this moment, but I know there was several questions in there that would have given us the more specifics on what are people learning, and is it what we are intending them to learn, and what we're hoping they'll learn from an event like this. So that was our main. I think we missed a chance there to gain some more information on that. So we'll definitely change that.
Okay, and why is it that that's a question that you want to ask? What is it about that question that would be particularly useful to you, do you think?
Oh, well, I think mainly it would help us with planning for our interpretation at these events, how we structure these events, and should these events continue, because if people aren't learning I guess should certain events continue if people aren't taking away from them what we are intending them to take away based on our organizational mission. So it could have a huge payoff for people, showing people that are involved on the board, that this event, even though you may really strongly feel that we've done it for 25 years and we must continue, people aren't always taking away what we hope they take away, or if we get answers like, and I wouldn't be surprised if we did at certain events, I come because I like to spend time with the other members. Well, we could find a way to structure that without dedicating a lot of time to the educational component of it. So then again, I'm sure we have events that we'd survey people that we'd be surprised, wow, they're really taking away a lot more than we even realize. So I think the main payoff would be that we could start using it, incorporating it into our long-term educational planning.
Excellent. And Mary, how about you? Were there questions you wish you would have asked on here?
Yes, this I didn't do as much as Matt said with the what did you learn questions. What do you take away from this? What did you carry with you when you left? What was your emotional response to some of the things we did? I think that I'd like to do more of that, but it also leads me to want to do more, ironically, not special event surveys, but the surveys of regular visitors, and ask them those kinds of questions just for coming to our organization, to our facility. And I think that these survey events are very useful, but I think I would like to move into that other direction even more because of my experience with the survey events. So.
Ha ha ha. The chicken worked. The chicken worked. I provided chicken and it worked.
Could I add one more thing?
I was going to say yes. I was going to say I did want to ask both of you as a wrap up.
So I think the next step is that I really need. I mean, this is a pilot we agreed to with you, Stacy, and I really need to take this now and find a way to make sure that all the organizational stakeholders have buy-in into this surveying process. The way our organization works is that we operate as a partnership between a private not-for-profit and a government entity. So it takes a lot of talking to get buy-in with everybody sometimes, and everybody has different. There's a lot of different views on where the museum should be going. And one of the things I'm always hoping to get everybody to buy into is that we don't have to talk about it from as a group. We can go to the public and see what is the public looking for us to do, and really draw that information in. So the next step for me is really to take out what we're going to do in the future, or what we need to focus on when we can look at all this data here and start building from that. And if it's not everything we need, then we can look at the questions bank or formulate new questions. And then the fact that it's a ready-made survey with a backing from a national organization like the AASLH helps considerably to getting a group to buy into a survey. So we don't have to spend any time, doing social research or, reading about how to conduct surveys or anything like that at this point. So that's really helpful.
All right, and Mary, before you describe your next steps, I'm just going to ask if anyone in the audience has questions for Matt or Mary, so you want to go ahead and type those into the chat box while Mary is telling us about her next steps and other observations.
Okay. Yeah, we're an organization in transition. Our director of many years has just retired, so we're replacing that, and we're also just looking at the position and seeing how it might be reconfigured depending on who fills it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is we're also just digesting. We had a CAP assessment last year, which assessed
conservation assessment program.
Yeah,
assessment?
Right, and which assessed our building and our collection, changing it. We haven't had any real focus groups or input from the community on that in several years. How are we serving you? What do you think the museum should be? What should be the stories we're telling? How do you like what we're doing? Blah, blah, blah. So I think that this is a good start to get us to think about those questions.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate you being willing to try this out, but also to be willing to talk about it on a national platform. We also had that question, Connie. I'll ask you if you might be willing to address using online surveys and how that works and the kinds of things you can find out. I see that Susan Watts has made some observations about her work in that. Connie, would you like to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I want to thank Rebecca for posing that question and also for Susan's input. I'm a big fan of online surveys for several reasons. First of all, they're very real. Secondly, more importantly, what online surveys do, as well as mail surveys do, is they allow people to feel free to be more honest about what they think about your programs and events. And second of all, what it does is it gives people time to think about and reflect on what they really thought about the experience. I always liken this to when you go to a movie that maybe is a pretty heavy movie with lots of messages, and if I were to stop you coming out of the theater and ask you, what do you think about that movie, and what do you think the main ideas are? You can imagine it'd be hard-pressed to really respond because you haven't given your brain enough time to reflect, digest, and then articulate opinion. But when someone gets a survey online, they've had time to discuss with their family and friends what they liked about the event, what they learned, what they didn't learn, and they're much more. I find people more honest and articulate with online surveys. Of course, the trick is just making sure you get everyone's email and letting them know that that email will only be used for the survey, and asking them if they would opt in to participating in a survey. So I don't have time to go into all the details, and maybe we put one open-ended question out there. And hopefully it's a question that's related to your mission, related to something that you're thinking about doing in the future. And I think you will get some really interesting and insightful responses.
And I'd also kind of like to echo that and to echo Susan's comments that when you start doing this work, you realize that doing a visitor study is not just kind of a tool to gather data, but it's also something that motivates you to really think about what you want to get out of an activity or out of your museum experience or out of a special event. It makes your staff and your volunteers really think about that. And helps you put the visitor at the center of that, thinking about it from the point of view of the visitor. And I think that's one of the really big advantages of doing this work. We do have a couple other questions there in the chat. I'm going to put a couple more poll questions out here, and then while you are answering those poll questions, we will go ahead and try to answer some of those other things. Oh, I'm going to move this around just a little bit, hopefully. Sorry if people are chasing that around the screen. If there are other things we can do to help you better use the tools of visitor studies and evaluation. So I'm going to post that question in the chat box, but also let's see if we can't address Dennis's question. Are there times when surveys are best done anonymously and times when they are not? Connie, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean about anonymously. Do you mean having someone not with your organization conduct the surveys? If you're talking about that, that's always a wonderful idea. You know, when I worked at Conny Williamsburg, I depended on graduate students and volunteers that I trained to do surveys. And we used to always I always had them start the surveys with, you know, I am a student, I'm a volunteer, and I had nothing to do with planning this event. So you won't hurt my feelings if you have some suggestions.
It also looks like Dennis is interested in the visitors not having to sort of sign their feedback, not having to say it was me who said this, where they're able to keep their own anonymity.
Not in the name. Okay. I never, you know, usually we don't ask for people to put their names on surveys because what you're doing when you get all your data in is you're looking for trends. The survey that we have now asks if you want to be a member, you know, or want information about membership or maybe information about future events, that people can put their name on. But normally, you don't ask people for their names with a survey. It really is no need to ask that information. Especially, I would think, if you're at a really small site in a small town, everybody knows everybody.
Program with a kid focus, and about whether or not you talk with the parents or the students or both.
Yeah, I think a long run in camp, you need both. I've been in situations where I've gotten one response from the parents and a very different response from the children. And anyone who's been a parent knows that sometimes it's really hard, even as a parent, to know what your kid really thought about a camp per se. So I would definitely do both. And, you know, there are ways you can incorporate questions into the camp as you're going about. I mean, especially if it's a long-running camp, I would definitely get kids' feedback several times throughout the camp. You don't
talked about evaluation at the beginning and how you feel after, and I'm excited to see that we've moved some folks from overwhelmed and inexperienced into the empowered category and perhaps more into the interested category. So that's reassuring for me in terms of thinking about our outcomes. And again, I will reiterate that we are wondering as a group if there are other ways that we could help you better use the tools of visitor studies and evaluation. So if you have thoughts on that, please type that into the chat box. But we do have some information here about what you can do next if you're sort of thinking about how to use visitor studies. We, of course, would love for you to share your feedback about the webinar. So what you can do next is click on this link up at the top and do an online survey about the webinar. We would love to have you share your feedback with us as we plan for future events and as AASLH plans for future work with its affinity groups. And of course, any of those files, but please feel free to download the survey event template, the question bank that we spent some time discussing, guidelines for conducting surveys, which are if you're doing those interview type surveys, and the Excel spreadsheet that will help you evaluate the data that you can essentially type in your numbers and pretty charts will come out, and those are great things to be able to share with folks who aren't really numbers people but are pictures people. And you can use those with your board and your staff and your volunteers. So we do hope that you will download those and use those, adapt them as you see fit. If you are interested in kind of that more anonymous experience for both the visitor and for the person collecting the data, you might consider looking at AASLH's Visitors Count program. That's a program that ASLH offers that is a pre-made survey that allows you to benchmark your institution against other institutions. There is a fee for that program, but it's a really neat program. We've done it here at the Indiana Historical Society and have found it very useful. We would also encourage you, we didn't mention at the beginning of the project that part of this process that brought Connie and I together is that we co-authored a chapter in the Small Museum Toolkit, which is a publication from Altamira Press that is a 6-book series that gets you access to all sorts of information you might need if you're running a small museum. And we would love to have you join our affinity groups, and there's links there to our web pages within AASLH there for both Visitor Voices, which Connie's a member, and post blogs. We will share this webinar, will be archived on the Small Museum online community as well as with the documents. It will also be archived on the Visitor Voices page within AASLH. So if you've found this information useful, you can send it on to folks, but if you want them to have a chance to check out the webinar itself, it will be archived for folks to watch later, and that should be up in about a week or two. And then, of course, we've put our email addresses if you'd like to follow up with either of us. We'd love to hear about what it is you're working on and encourage you to do this kind of work. I'm looking to see if there's anything here in the chat box we need to respond to. Connie, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone, especially Matt and Mary, and I also want to thank Sherry Cook and Terry Jackson for helping to put this on.
All right, and Susan, if you haven't found the template, it should be the very first document in that set of downloads, special event survey template. So hopefully folks are able to get a hold of all of those. And again, I would like in the chat. Otherwise, we hope to see you all at the AASLH conference in Birmingham, Alabama this September, or virtually through the online conference that they offer, or as part of our affinity groups. All right, I'm going to try to expand out my, I see that there's still some trouble. I'm going to expand out our survey box. And if anybody is having any trouble downloading those, you can just email me directly at that stacyklingler@gmail.com email, and I will reply back with the documents. So hopefully that will have helped folks out if they have any other questions for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so that folks can get to all the places they need to get to. All right, and thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and hope that you have fun jumping in, getting your feet wet, getting your head wet, getting your body wet, and doing the whole visitor studies thing.